There is a part of you that you have never fully met, a part that you have spent your entire life trying to hide, suppress, and pretend does not exist. And yet it is there. It has always been there, quietly shaping your decisions, your relationships, your reactions, and your deepest fears. Carl Jung called it the shadow, and understanding it might be the most important psychological work you ever do. Today we are going on a journey into the darkest and most misunderstood part of the human psyche. We are going to explore what the shadow is, where it comes from, how it controls your life without your awareness, and what happens when you finally have the courage to face it. This is not comfortable material. Some of what you hear today will challenge how you see yourself. But if you stay with it, if you commit to this conversation all the way to the end, you will walk away with a level of self-understanding that most people never achieve in their entire lifetime. If this is the kind of content that makes you think differently about yourself and the world around you, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. Every week we go this deep into the psychology of what it means to be human. You do not want to miss what is coming. Now, let us begin. Who was Carl Jung, and why does his work still matter? Before we go into the shadow itself, we need to spend a moment understanding the man who discovered it. Because Carl Jung was not just a psychologist, he was an explorer, a cartographer of the human soul. Carl Gustav Jung was born in Switzerland in 1875. He trained as a psychiatrist and became one of the closest collaborators of Sigmund Freud in the early days of psychoanalysis. But Jung was never fully satisfied with Freud's framework. He believed that Freud focused too narrowly on sexuality and repressed trauma as the drivers of human behavior. Jung sensed something larger at work. He broke from Freud in 1913 and spent the years that followed in what he himself described as a confrontation with the unconscious. He deliberately explored the deepest layers of his own psyche, recording his visions, dreams, and inner dialogues in a private journal that would not be published until decades after his death, known as the Red Book. What emerged from that period of profound inner exploration was a revolutionary model of the human mind. Jung proposed that the psyche was not just composed of the conscious mind and the personal unconscious as Freud had suggested. He believed there was a deeper layer he called the collective unconscious, a vast reservoir of shared human experience expressed through universal symbols and patterns he called archetypes. And within his model of the psyche, one of the most powerful and most dangerous of all these archetypes was the shadow. Jung spent the rest of his long life, he lived until 1961, refining and expanding his understanding of the shadow. He wrote extensively about it. He worked with patients through it, and he concluded that the shadow was not simply a problem to be solved or eliminated. It was a fundamental part of what it means to be human, and engaging with it honestly was the central task of psychological maturity. His work remains as relevant today as it was a century ago, perhaps more so, because we live in a time when the pressure to present a perfect, curated version of ourselves has never been greater, and the shadow has never been more aggressively suppressed. What is the shadow? Let us define our terms clearly, because the shadow is one of those concepts that people often think they understand before they really do. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, is the unconscious part of your personality that contains everything you have rejected, denied, suppressed, or hidden about yourself. It is the repository of everything you decided, usually very early in life, was unacceptable, shameful, wrong, too much, not enough. It is important to understand what Jung meant when he said unconscious. He did not mean forgotten in the way you might forget where you put your keys. He meant genuinely outside of awareness. The contents of the shadow are not things you are choosing not to think about. They are things you literally cannot see in yourself because they have been buried beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. Jung described the shadow as the person you would rather not be. It is the parts of your personality that you have disowned. The anger you were told was wrong to feel. The ambition you were taught was selfish. The sexuality that was shamed. The vulnerability that was punished. The neediness that was rejected. The jealousy you could never admit to. The cruelty you are capable of but refuse to acknowledge. All of these rejected pieces do not disappear when you push them down. They go underground. They form the shadow. And from that underground place, they continue to influence everything you do. Here is a metaphor that might help. Imagine you are cleaning your house before guests arrive. You go through every room and you gather up everything that is messy, embarrassing, or that you do not want people to see, and you shove it all into a closet and close the door. The guests arrive. The house looks perfect. You feel in control, but the closet is still there, and it is getting fuller. And sometimes, at the worst possible moments, the door flies open and everything tumbles out in front of everyone. That closet is your shadow. And the longer you spend stuffing things in there, without ever sorting through them, the more chaotic and powerful its contents become. Where does the shadow come from? The shadow is not something you were born with. It is something that formed in response to your environment. Specifically, in response to what you learned was acceptable and unacceptable about who you are. Jung understood that every child is born with a full range of human potential, the capacity for love and hatred, for generosity and selfishness, for courage and cowardice, for creativity and destruction. All of it is present at the beginning. But very quickly, the socialization process begins. Parents, teachers, religious communities, cultural norms, and peer groups all send messages about which parts of this full human range are acceptable and which are not. Be nice. Do not be angry. Do not be too loud. Do not be too much. Be more like your sister. Boys do not cry. Good girls do not behave that way. You are so selfish. Who do you think you are? These messages, delivered repeatedly over the formative years of childhood, teach the child which parts of themselves are safe to express and which parts must be hidden. The parts that receive approval are integrated into the conscious personality, what Jung called the persona. The parts that are rejected go into the shadow. This process is not the result of bad parenting in most cases. It is the inevitable consequence of socialization. Every human being who grows up in a society with norms and expectations will develop a shadow. It is not a sign that something went wrong. It is a sign that you adapted to your environment, which is exactly what children are designed to do. But the adaptation comes with a cost, because the parts of yourself that went into the shadow did not go willingly. They went under protest, and they have been trying to get out ever since. There is also something important that Jung observed about positive qualities and the shadow. Most people assume the shadow only contains negative traits: darkness, aggression, selfishness, and cruelty. But Jung was very clear that the shadow can also contain positive qualities that were suppressed. A child who was raised to be humble may have pushed their confidence and ambition into the shadow because expressing those traits felt dangerous or wrong. A person raised in an environment where intellectual achievement was devalued may have buried their intelligence. Someone who grew up in a family where vulnerability was mocked may have hidden their capacity for deep emotional connection. These buried positive qualities are what Jung called the golden shadow, and reclaiming them is just as important as confronting the darker aspects of the shadow self. How the shadow controls your life. This is where things get truly fascinating and genuinely uncomfortable, because most people go through their entire lives completely unaware that their shadow exists, and yet the shadow is shaping nearly every significant area of their life. Let us look at the primary mechanisms through which the shadow operates. The first and most well-known mechanism is projection. Projection is the unconscious process of taking something that belongs to you, something in your own shadow, and perceiving it as belonging to someone else. You cannot see the rejected quality in yourself, so you see it in other people instead. This is why Jung said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. When you feel a disproportionately strong reaction to someone, when someone irritates you, angers you, or repulses you in a way that seems bigger than the situation warrants, that is almost always a signal that you are projecting your shadow onto them. The quality that bothers you so intensely in that other person is a quality that lives in your own shadow. You cannot tolerate it in them because you cannot tolerate it in yourself. Think about someone in your life who irritates you, really irritates you. Now ask yourself honestly, not defensively, but honestly, whether any version of that quality exists in you. You may need to sit with that question for a while. The answer is rarely obvious at first, because the whole point of projection is that you cannot see it. A man who is furious at what he perceives as arrogance in his colleague may be projecting his own suppressed ambition and need for recognition. A woman who is disgusted by what she sees as neediness in her friend may be projecting her own suppressed longing for connection and care. A person who is outraged by the dishonesty they perceive in others may be projecting their own capacity for self-deception. Projection does not only happen with qualities we dislike. The golden shadow is also projected. When you put someone on a pedestal, when you idealize them, when you believe they possess qualities so extraordinary that you could never hope to match them, you may be projecting your own golden shadow onto them. The qualities you admire so intensely in them are often qualities that live undeveloped within you. The second mechanism through which the shadow operates is what Jung called the shadow eruption. Remember the closet metaphor. When the door flies open and everything tumbles out, that is a shadow eruption. These are the moments when something in your shadow bursts through your conscious control and expresses itself in ways that surprise even you. Have you ever said something cruel in an argument that shocked you with its viciousness? Have you ever done something self-destructive that seemed to come from nowhere? Have you ever had a reaction to a situation that was so out of proportion that you later wondered where it came from? These are shadow eruptions. They tend to happen most often when you are stressed, tired, emotionally compromised, or when something in your environment has touched a particularly sensitive part of your shadow. The defenses are down, the closet door flies open, and out comes the part of you that you have been trying to keep hidden. The third mechanism is self-sabotage. This is one of the shadow's most insidious and least understood operations. The shadow can sabotage your conscious goals when those goals threaten its existence. If you have spent your life believing you are not someone who deserves success, that belief lives in your shadow, and when you start to achieve success, your shadow will undermine it. You will procrastinate at crucial moments. You will make inexplicable mistakes right when things are going well. You will unconsciously create conflict or chaos that derails your progress, not because you are weak or stupid, but because some part of you, buried in the shadow, is deeply threatened by the idea of you succeeding. This is why people with enormous talent sometimes never fulfill their potential. This is why people keep ending up in the same kinds of destructive relationships even when they know intellectually they should choose differently. This is why some people seem to pull disaster toward themselves no matter how hard they try to avoid it. The shadow is not random. It is consistent. It has its own logic and its own agenda, and until you bring it into the light, it will continue to run significant portions of your life from the underground. The fourth mechanism is physical and emotional symptoms. Jung believed, and modern research increasingly supports, that the contents of the shadow do not just affect behavior, they also affect the body and emotional life. Chronic anxiety, depression, physical tension, psychosomatic symptoms, and a pervasive sense of emptiness can all be expressions of shadow material that has not been processed. The energy required to keep the shadow suppressed is enormous. It is like holding a beach ball underwater. It takes constant effort, and that effort depletes your vitality, your creativity, your capacity for joy, and your ability to be fully present in your life. Many people walk through their lives feeling vaguely disconnected, vaguely dissatisfied, vaguely as if something important is missing, without ever understanding that what is missing is the wholeness that comes from integrating the shadow. The collective shadow. Before we go into how to work with the shadow, we need to spend some time on one of Jung's most important and most disturbing observations. The shadow does not only exist in individuals, it exists in groups, communities, and entire societies. Jung called this the collective shadow, and he believed it was responsible for some of the most catastrophic events in human history. When a group of people collectively projects their shadow onto another group, the results can be devastating. Every form of prejudice, discrimination, scapegoating, and persecution throughout history can be understood through the lens of collective shadow projection. The group takes the qualities it most fears and denies in itself, its capacity for violence, greed, corruption, and moral failure, and projects them wholesale onto an outgroup. The outgroup becomes the repository of everything the in-group refuses to see in itself, and this projection creates the psychological permission to treat the outgroup as less than human. Jung watched this process unfold with horrifying clarity in the rise of Nazi Germany. He saw an entire nation projecting its collective shadow onto Jewish people and others, using that projection to justify atrocities that the individuals committing them would likely have found unthinkable in other circumstances. He warned repeatedly that the collective shadow was the greatest psychological danger facing modern civilization, not external enemies, not natural disasters, but the refusal of groups to acknowledge and integrate their own darkness. This observation is as urgent today as it was in Jung's time, perhaps more so. We live in a time of intense polarization in which groups on all sides project their shadows onto each other with increasing ferocity. The demonization of the other, whoever the other happens to be in a given context, is a collective shadow projection, and it serves the same psychological function that individual projection does. It allows the group to avoid confronting the darkness within itself by locating that darkness entirely in someone else. Understanding the collective shadow does not mean that all positions are equally valid or that there are no real differences between groups. It means that the intensity of hatred and contempt that people feel toward outgroups is almost never fully explained by the actual qualities of those outgroups. Some significant portion of that intensity comes from the shadow, and recognizing that is essential for any honest examination of how we relate to each other as human beings. If this video is giving you a new lens through which to see yourself and the world, this is a good moment to subscribe if you have not already. We go this deep every single week, and the next few sections of this video are going to take everything we have covered so far and bring it into your actual daily life. Do not go anywhere. The shadow in relationships. Nowhere does the shadow express itself more powerfully or more painfully than in intimate relationships. This is why Jung said that the most intense emotional reactions we have to other people are almost always about ourselves. Romantic relationships in particular are extraordinarily fertile ground for shadow material. This is partly because intimacy lowers our defenses, and with lowered defenses come shadow eruptions. But it is also because we unconsciously choose partners who carry our projected shadows. This is one of the most challenging ideas in Jungian psychology. The qualities that attract you most powerfully to another person, especially in the early, electric stages of falling in love, often correspond to qualities that live in your own shadow. A person who has suppressed their spontaneity and sense of adventure because they were raised to be responsible and serious will be magnetically attracted to someone who is free-spirited and impulsive. What they are responding to is not just the other person. They are responding to a reflection of their own golden shadow, a part of themselves they have not given permission to exist. This is beautiful in the beginning. The other person seems to complete you. They have what you lack. They are what you have always wished you could be. But then the relationship matures. The initial intoxication fades, and the very qualities that attracted you begin to drive you to distraction. The free-spirited partner now seems irresponsible. The spontaneous partner now seems chaotic and unreliable, and you find yourself trying to change them, to make them more like you, to suppress in them the very qualities that drew you in the first place. What has happened is that the projection has started to break down. You are beginning to see the real person rather than the screen onto which you were projecting your shadow. And this moment, this painful and disillusioning moment, is actually one of the greatest opportunities for psychological growth that a relationship offers. Because if you can resist the impulse to blame the other person, if you can turn the question inward and ask yourself what this reaction is telling you about yourself, you have the chance to reclaim a piece of your own shadow, to develop the quality in yourself rather than outsourcing it to a partner. The same dynamic operates in conflicts. When you are in an argument with a partner and you find yourself feeling a level of rage or contempt or hurt that seems disproportionate to the situation, the shadow is almost certainly involved. The current situation has activated something old, something that was buried long before this relationship began, and the partner becomes the target of feelings that actually belong to the shadow. This is not to excuse genuinely harmful behavior in relationships. Some things that happen in relationships are simply wrong and need to be addressed as such. But the emotional intensity with which we respond to those things, the speed with which we go from zero to overwhelming feeling, is very often a shadow indicator. The most honest and courageous thing you can do in a relationship is to learn to ask yourself, in the middle of a strong reaction, how much of this is about what is actually happening right now, and how much of this is coming from somewhere deeper in me. The shadow in your professional life. The shadow does not stay at home when you go to work. It follows you everywhere. And in professional environments, where the pressure to present a competent, controlled, and likable persona is intense, the shadow often operates with particular force. Consider jealousy. Professional jealousy is one of the most universally experienced and least openly discussed human emotions. When a colleague is promoted, praised, or successful in a way that triggers something uncomfortable in you, that discomfort is shadow material. On the surface, it might look like resentment of the colleague, but underneath, almost always, is something more personal, a fear that you are not good enough, a suppressed ambition that you have not given yourself permission to pursue, a belief that success is for other people, but not for you. The colleague has not done anything to you. They have simply activated your shadow by achieving something that your shadow contains the desire for. Similarly, the impulse to undermine others, to gossip, to subtly sabotage a colleague's efforts, is almost always driven by shadow material. It is the shadow's way of trying to level the playing field from underground, rather than doing the harder work of developing your own capacities and confidence above ground. Perfectionism is another common shadow manifestation in professional life. The perfectionist, on the surface, appears to be someone with extraordinarily high standards, and that may be true. But underneath perfectionism almost always lives a deep fear of being exposed as inadequate. The shadow contains the belief that the real you, without the armor of perfect performance, is not acceptable. And perfectionism is the strategy the ego has developed to keep that shadow belief from ever being confirmed. The shadow also operates in how we relate to authority. If you have a strong automatic reaction to authority figures, whether that is deference, rebellion, resentment, or a compulsive need to please, that reaction is rooted in shadow material. It comes from early experiences with authority, usually parents, that created patterns of response which are now being replayed in every professional relationship with a person in power. Dreams, as the language of the shadow. Jung believed that one of the primary ways the shadow communicates with the conscious mind is through dreams. He spent decades studying the dreams of his patients and developing a sophisticated understanding of how dream imagery maps onto the inner landscape of the psyche. In dreams, the shadow often appears as a figure of the same gender as the dreamer, a shadowy stranger, a threatening pursuer, a dark twin, a figure that feels menacing or deeply uncomfortable. But Jung was very clear that these dream figures should not be understood as enemies. They are messengers. They are carrying material that the conscious mind needs to integrate. And the more threatening the shadow figure in a dream, the more urgently the psyche is trying to get your attention about something important. If you have recurring nightmares, recurring themes of being chased, attacked, or pursued by a threatening figure, Jung would say this is the shadow demanding acknowledgement. The dream is not random. It is purposeful. It is the unconscious mind's way of bringing forward something that consciousness needs to see. Working with dreams as a way of accessing shadow material is a sophisticated practice. It requires learning to relate to dream imagery symbolically rather than literally. But even a basic practice of recording your dreams and sitting with the feelings they generate can begin to open the door to shadow material in a meaningful way. If you dream of a particular person repeatedly, especially someone who disturbs or troubles you, ask yourself what quality that person represents to you. Not who they are in your waking life, but what they symbolize in the dream. That quality is almost certainly something that lives in your shadow. The physical body and the shadow. One aspect of Jung's work on the shadow that is often overlooked is his understanding of the relationship between the shadow and the physical body. Jung observed that the shadow does not only express itself through behavior and emotion, it expresses itself through the body. Physical symptoms, chronic tension, recurring illnesses, and somatic complaints can all be understood as the body's way of carrying shadow material that has not been consciously processed. This insight has been dramatically confirmed by subsequent research. The work of Peter Levine on somatic experiencing, Bessel van der Kolk on the body and trauma, and numerous other researchers has established beyond any reasonable doubt that the body keeps a record of our psychological experiences. That unprocessed emotional material does not simply remain in the mind, it lives in the tissues, the muscles, the nervous system, and the organs. Where in your body do you carry tension? Where do you feel constricted or numb? Where do physical symptoms recur without clear medical explanation? These locations can be doorways into shadow material. This is not to suggest that all physical illness has a purely psychological cause. That would be an oversimplification that does a disservice to people suffering from genuine physical conditions. But Jung's insight that the body and the psyche are not separate systems, but aspects of a single whole, is one of his most enduring and most practically important contributions. Practices that work with the body, movement, breathwork, somatic therapy, yoga, martial arts, dance, can all be powerful ways of accessing and beginning to release shadow material that has been stored physically. Beginning the work of shadow integration. We have spent a significant amount of time understanding what the shadow is and how it operates. Now we turn to the most important question. What do you actually do with this knowledge? Jung called the process of engaging with and integrating the shadow individuation. He described it as the central task of the second half of life, the process by which a person becomes, as fully as possible, who they actually are, rather than who they were shaped to be. It is important to be clear about what shadow integration is not. It is not about unleashing your darkest impulses. It is not about acting on everything you have suppressed. It is not about becoming a worse person or abandoning your values. Shadow integration is about becoming a more whole person. It is about bringing the unconscious contents of the shadow into conscious awareness so that they no longer control you from underground. You do not have to act on what you find in the shadow, but you do have to acknowledge it. You do have to own it as part of you. Jung famously said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Here is how to begin. The first practice is shadow journaling. Set aside time each day, even just 15 minutes, to write honestly about your emotional reactions. Focus particularly on strong reactions, disproportionate anger, jealousy, contempt, admiration, disgust. These are the signposts pointing toward shadow material. For each strong reaction, ask yourself a series of questions. What exactly triggered this reaction? What quality am I responding to in the other person or situation? Is there any version of this quality in me? What would it mean about me if this quality were actually part of who I am? What am I afraid would happen if I acknowledge this? Write without censoring yourself. The journal is private. It is a space for radical honesty, and radical honesty with yourself is the foundation of all shadow work. The second practice is working with projections deliberately. Every time you notice a strong reaction to another person, treat it as an invitation rather than just a response. Before you dismiss it or act on it, pause and ask the projection question. What am I seeing in this person that might belong to me? This does not mean you have to conclude that every reaction is projection. Sometimes people genuinely behave badly and your reaction is appropriate. But developing the habit of asking the question creates the psychological flexibility that shadow work requires. You can also work with admiration as projection. Think of someone you deeply admire, someone you put on a pedestal. Now ask yourself what specific quality you are responding to, and then ask yourself honestly whether you have access to any version of that quality within yourself. Almost always, the answer is yes. You would not even be able to recognize the quality in someone else if some version of it did not exist in you. The third practice is active imagination. This was one of Jung's own preferred methods for engaging with shadow material. Active imagination involves entering a relaxed, meditative state and deliberately engaging in an inner dialogue with shadow figures. You might close your eyes and visualize the shadow figure from a dream, or simply invite whatever part of you has been hiding to come forward and speak. Then you engage with it. You ask it what it wants, what it needs, what it has been trying to tell you, and you listen. This practice sounds unusual and perhaps even unsettling, and it is not recommended for people who are in acute psychological distress or who have serious mental health conditions without the support of a qualified therapist. But for people who are psychologically stable and genuinely committed to inner work, active imagination can yield extraordinary insights. The key to active imagination is the same as the key to all shadow work. You must approach what emerges with curiosity rather than judgment, with openness rather than fear. The shadow is not your enemy. It is a part of you that has been in exile, and exiled parts do not need to be defeated. They need to be understood and welcomed home. The fourth practice is seeking the feedback of trusted others. Because the shadow by definition is outside of our own awareness, other people can sometimes see our shadow more clearly than we can. A trusted friend, partner, or therapist who is willing to be honest with you about patterns they observe in your behavior can be an invaluable resource for shadow work. This requires both courage on your part and wisdom in choosing who you ask. Not everyone is equipped to give this kind of feedback skillfully. You are looking for someone who can be honest without being cruel, who can point to patterns without using them to attack you, who has enough self-awareness themselves to distinguish between what they genuinely observe in you and what they might be projecting. If you are working with a therapist, particularly one trained in depth psychology or Jungian approaches, they are ideally positioned to help you identify and work with shadow material. Many of the insights that emerge in good therapy are essentially shadow material being brought to light in a safe and supported context. The fifth practice is creative expression. Art, writing, music, movement, and other forms of creative expression have always been powerful pathways into the unconscious. When you give yourself permission to create without judgment, without trying to produce something impressive or acceptable, material from the shadow often finds its way to the surface. Automatic writing, where you write continuously without pausing to edit or evaluate, can be a particularly effective way of accessing shadow material through language. Visual art made without concern for aesthetic quality can reveal inner imagery that the conscious mind would otherwise filter out. Dance and movement without choreography or rules can allow the body to express what the mind has suppressed. The key in all creative shadow work is the suspension of the inner critic. The inner critic is the guardian of the persona. Its job is to ensure that only acceptable material gets expressed. In shadow work, you need to temporarily sideline it. The rewards of shadow work. We have talked a great deal about the challenges of shadow work, about how uncomfortable it is to confront what lives in the dark. It is worth spending some time on why you would want to do this work at all, because the rewards are extraordinary. The first reward is authenticity. When you integrate your shadow, you stop performing. You stop spending enormous amounts of energy maintaining a persona that is carefully constructed to be acceptable to everyone. You become more genuinely yourself. And genuine selfhood, even with all its imperfections, is far more compelling and far more satisfying than any performance could ever be. People who have done significant shadow work carry a quality of presence that is immediately recognizable. They are not trying to impress you. They are not managing your perception of them. They are simply there, fully, with all of themselves. And that quality of full presence is one of the most magnetic and most healing things one human being can offer another. The second reward is the end of projection. When you own your shadow rather than projecting it, your relationships transform. You stop seeing enemies everywhere. You stop being triggered by qualities in others that you refuse to see in yourself. You develop a genuine compassion for human complexity including your own, that makes intimacy possible in a way it never was before. This does not mean you become a pushover or that you stop having appropriate responses to genuinely harmful behavior. It means that your responses become proportionate and conscious rather than reactive and driven by shadow material. The third reward is the reclamation of your energy. Remember the beach ball held underwater. The energy required to suppress the shadow is immense. When that energy is no longer needed for suppression, it becomes available for life. People who do serious shadow work often describe a feeling of increased vitality, creativity, and aliveness, not because their circumstances have changed, but because they are no longer depleting themselves in the maintenance of denial. The fourth reward is access to your golden shadow. As you do shadow work, you do not only encounter the darker aspects of what you have suppressed, you also begin to reclaim the positive qualities that went into hiding. The creativity, the confidence, the joy, the sensuality, the ambition, the tenderness, the brilliance that were pushed into the shadow because they did not feel safe to express. Reclaiming these qualities is one of the most profoundly joyful aspects of shadow work, because it is the experience of coming home to yourself, of discovering that the person you always sensed you could be was there all along, waiting for you to give them permission to exist. The fifth reward is genuine compassion. One of the most surprising outcomes of honest shadow work is the development of a deeper compassion, not just for yourself, but for other people. When you have truly reckoned with your own capacity for darkness, you can no longer sustain the comfortable fiction that you are fundamentally different from people who behave badly. This is not moral relativism. It is not the position that nothing matters, or that all behavior is equally acceptable. It is the recognition that the same shadow that drives destruction in others also lives in you, and that recognition breeds humility. And from humility comes genuine compassion, not the condescending kind that looks down from a position of superiority, but the real kind that recognizes a shared humanity, even in its most flawed expressions. Jung believed that this compassion, born of genuine self-knowledge, was one of the highest achievements of psychological development, and it is a compassion that the world desperately needs. A word about professional support. Shadow work is profound and important. It is also, at times, genuinely difficult. Some of what surfaces in the process of shadow integration can be painful, disorienting, and overwhelming. If you find that engaging with your shadow brings up material that feels too heavy to carry alone, please do not try to carry it alone. Seek the support of a qualified therapist, particularly one trained in depth psychology, Jungian analysis, or trauma-informed approaches. There is no virtue in doing this work without support, when support is available and needed. Jung himself worked with a therapist throughout much of his professional life. He understood that the psyche is too complex and too deep for any one person to navigate entirely on their own. Therapy is not a sign of weakness. It is the most intelligent and courageous response to the recognition that you are a complex human being who deserves skilled help in navigating that complexity. If you are already working with a therapist, and this video has raised things you want to explore further, bring it to your next session. Use what you have learned here as a starting point for a deeper conversation. Bringing it all together. We have covered an enormous amount of ground today. Let us take a moment to bring it all together before we close. Carl Jung identified the shadow as the unconscious part of the personality that contains everything we have rejected, denied, or suppressed about ourselves. It forms in childhood through the process of socialization. It operates through projection, eruption, self-sabotage, and physical symptoms. It shapes our relationships, our professional lives, our dreams, and our bodies. It exists not only in individuals, but in groups and entire societies. And yet, the shadow is not our enemy. It is a part of us, a part that has been in exile, waiting for the courage and the compassion to be welcomed home. The process of shadow integration, which Jung called individuation, is the central task of psychological maturity. It requires honesty, courage, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. It is not comfortable work, But it is the most important work a human being can do. Because on the other side of shadow work is something extraordinary. A life lived in greater wholeness, in greater authenticity, in greater compassion. A life in which you are no longer run by forces you cannot see. A life in which you are not just a polished persona moving through the world, but a full human being, shadows and light together, genuinely and unapologetically alive. Jung said it best himself: the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But he also said this: the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. You have spent enough time running from the darkest parts of yourself. It is time to turn around, to face what is there, and to discover that what you were so afraid of was never a monster. It was always just you, waiting to be found. Final words. If you made it to the end of this video, you have just done something that most people never do. You sat with one of the most challenging and most important ideas in all of psychology for nearly an hour. You did not look away, and that willingness to stay present with difficult material is itself the beginning of shadow work. I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me which part of this video hit closest to home for you. Was it the section on projection, on relationships, on how the shadow forms in childhood? On the collective shadow, tell me what landed, because your responses help me understand what to go deeper on in future videos. And if this video gave you something real, something that shifted how you see yourself or the people around you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Shadow work does not happen in isolation. It happens in community, in conversation, in the willingness to be honest with each other about the full complexity of what it means to be human. Subscribe if you have not already. Every week we go this deep, into the psychology of why we do what we do, why we feel what we feel, and what we can do to live with more awareness, more authenticity, and more genuine freedom. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your courage, and I will see you in the next one.